The quiet had never seemed so harsh. The day of my husband's interment, the chapel was thick with the scent of frankincense and low whispers. I was seated in the foremost row, clutching a folded linen cloth he had given me years ago. My hands shook, but I held it tightly, as if the material could prevent my collapse. My only desire was to weep, to let the anguish spill out like a deluge. However, I should have known they wouldn't permit it. Linny, my husband's sibling, leaned in towards another family member, her lips twisting in that familiar smirk she wore when she believed she was being clever. "She's always been delicate," she remarked, her voice just loud enough to hover above the hymn. "Look at her, already lost without him." Chuckles rippled between her and Caroline, our youngest niece. It wasn't friendly laughter or even anxious laughter. It was sharp, like shards of glass scraping my skin. As the casket was lowered, my chest felt like it was splitting. I wept openly, without shame, and that's when I heard it. Caroline's whisper was so clear it might as well have been a shout. Pathetic. She can't even compose herself. I wanted to yell, to turn and tell them that sorrow has no regulations, that losing the man I'd been with for over 40 years wasn't something I could just discreetly suppress. But the words withered in my throat, because that's what I'd learned from them over the years. Silence. Even my own son, Michael, didn't stand up for me. He kept his gaze lowered, shifting in his chair, pretending not to hear. He'd always been like that, too subdued, too anxious to maintain peace, even when that peace meant letting their words tear me apart. The burial concluded, the dirt was shoveled, and still their remarks kept drifting my way. Victor, my husband's elder brother, adjusted his blazer and stated, "Well, now she'll see what it's like to handle matters on her own, not that she ever did before." I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. The truth is, this wasn't anything new. Their ridicule had been a constant presence throughout my life. I'd grown accustomed to being the one in the shadows at family gatherings, the one they giggled at when I fumbled over a word or asked a question about business I wasn't supposed to comprehend. I'd been taught to swallow my humiliation and offer a polite smile. I'd hoped that grief might soften them, if only for a day, but I was wrong. They wouldn't even allow me to cry. I sat in that front pew with my husband's coffin before me, and every sob felt like a show they were grading, a flaw they were tallying against me. By the time the service ended, my sorrow had morphed into something else. Not hostility, not yet, but a kind of resilient seed taking root deep within my core. As we stepped out of the chapel into the cold air, Linny brushed past me with a smile too pointed to be mistaken for sympathy. "You'll have to rely on us now, Amanda. You've never been adept at handling things by yourself." The words landed more heavily than the soil on my husband's coffin. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat was raw from suppressing everything I wanted to say. But on the inside, something was stirring, something that felt almost like defiance. I had thought funerals were for lamenting, for remembering, but for me, it was the moment I realized how little they would ever permit me to be human. To them, I wasn't a widow, I wasn't a grieving spouse, I was an object of mockery, even in my deepest despair. That day, I buried my husband, but I also buried the last of my silence. When the funeral was finally over and the residence was cleared of floral arrangements and whispers, I sat by myself in the main room, gazing into the quiet. The stillness was peculiar. For 43 years, I had shared this house with my husband, Patrick. His presence was a constant, at times warm, at times distant, but always there. Now it was just me and the ticking of the antique clock. The quiet felt more oppressive than the casket we had lowered into the earth that morning. And with the quiet came a rush of memories. I thought back to the decades of meals, the holidays, the get-togethers where I was always the punchline, never the voice.
Lenny's eye rolling whenever I talked about literature or tending to my garden, Victor's stories about how I once overcooked a roast chicken, as if that singular event defined my whole life, Caroline's impersonation of my gentle voice in front of everyone. Even Michael, my own son, would occasionally join in the nervous laughter just to keep the peace. It wasn't one single sharp injury. It was a lifetime of countless small cuts. I became mere background noise in my own life. Patrick never participated in their mockery, but he never stopped it either. Instead, he would retreat into his study, that locked room with the thick draperies drawn. Whenever I asked what he did in there, he would only say, "Work, things you wouldn't find interesting." And I believed him, or perhaps I simply accepted it. That door became a symbol for me, a boundary between what I was allowed to touch and what was forbidden. I learned not to ask questions. I learned to be content with the tiny bits of life they left me. But sitting there after the funeral, staring into the quiet, I realized how much of my life had been spent being underestimated. I was always too tender, too emotional, too naive. They claimed I didn't comprehend business. They claimed I wouldn't endure without Patrick. And the worst part was, I believed them. I had built my world around small things: flowers on the windowsill, teacups stacked neatly, a garden cultivated in the backyard. Things they all sneered at, but things that brought me tranquility. I told myself it was enough, but now Patrick was gone, and the family was circling like predators. Their voices from the funeral still echoed in my mind. "She's never handled a thing. She won't know what to do." And I was terrified they might be right. Still, something inside me felt different. A seed had been planted in that church pew, a kind of quiet fury at being denied even my grief. For years I had let their laughter define me, but sitting there alone in the quiet of my house, I realized I had a choice. I could keep believing their story about me, or I could finally write my own. My gaze drifted toward the hallway, to that locked door, the study. It loomed in my memory like a secret I had lived alongside for decades but never touched. Patrick had kept it off limits to me. But why? Why had he needed such separation even from his wife? That's when I remembered the envelope. It was still on the side table, unopened among the sympathy cards. A simple white envelope with my name written on the front, in his handwriting. A strange detail considering Patrick had never been a man of letters. He preferred silence to words. I picked it up, my hands quivering as they had at the funeral. I slid my finger under the flap, and my heart nearly stopped when a brass key slipped into my palm. The note was short, almost abrupt. "Amanda, the study is now yours. Everything inside belongs to you. They will scoff, then they will plead, then they will try to take. Do not yield." I stared at the words, my breath caught in my throat. All my life I had been regarded as frail, mocked as if I had no fortitude. But Patrick had left me something. Not just the key to a locked room, but a warning, a command. For the first time in many years, I felt something stir inside me that wasn't sorrow or shame. It was resolve.
I must have read that note 100 times. They will scoff, then they will plead, then they will try to take. Do not yield. The words didn't even sound like Patrick. My husband was a man of few sentences, never the type to speak in riddles. And yet here he was, warning me from beyond the grave. The brass key felt heavy in my hand, as if it carried not just weight, but a choice. I told myself I would wait, that I was too raw from the funeral, too tired to face whatever secrets lay behind that locked door. But the more I tried to rest, the more that study whispered through the quiet of the house. It had always been a mystery. For decades, I dusted around its door, watered the plant that wilted by its curtained window, and set dinner on the table without ever asking why Patrick spent hours locked away inside. I thought it was pride or habit or some private right I wasn't meant to disturb. But now, knowing he had left it all to me, my mind reeled. By midnight, I couldn't resist any longer. I lit a lamp and padded down the hall.
The floorboards creaked beneath my slippers, each step sounding louder than I wanted. My hand shook as I slid the key into the lock. It fit too perfectly, as if it had been waiting for me all these years. The click echoed through the hall. When I pushed the door open, the air that spilled out was stale and cold, like a room that had been holding its breath for decades. Dust motes floated in the lamplight, tiny ghosts rising from the floorboards. The study was impeccable. Bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes, a desk polished to a dark luster, curtains pulled tight over the window, their edges frayed with age. The room smelled faintly of paper and ink, but also of something sharper, like metal. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, my eyes drawn to the desk first. On top of it sat a small stack of envelopes, each neatly tied with twine. Beside them, a leather-bound ledger and a pile of official documents stamped and sealed. I reached for the nearest folder, my hands trembling. The words inside almost didn't make sense at first. Property deeds, investment accounts, certificates of ownership. Each one bore my name, not Patrick's, mine. Page after page, document after document, all transferring wealth, land, and shares to me. I sank into the chair, my knees giving way. For 43 years, I had been scoffed at, dismissed, treated like a woman who couldn't manage a thing. And yet Patrick had entrusted me with everything. I pressed my fingers to my lips, fighting back tears. For once, they weren't from shame. They were from something else. A kind of fierce gratitude. A kind of rage, too. Rage that he hadn't told me, hadn't prepared me, but instead left me to discover it only after he was gone. And then I saw it. Another envelope placed squarely in the center of the desk, my name written across it in his careful, deliberate hand. I tore it open, my pulse thundering in my ears. Amanda, you will feel isolated. They will approach you with feigned compassion, with pleas, with threats. I have seen their avarice. Do not give in. What is here is yours, not theirs. Stay firm. This is the only justice I can leave you. I stared at the letter until the words blurred. Justice. That was the word he used. For years, I had endured their laughter, their insults, their dismissals. I had learned to live in quiet while they decided who I was. And Patrick had seen it all. He had seen it all. And in his own quiet, guarded way, he had left me the only weapon I would ever need. I folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into the envelope, and laid my hand flat on the desk. For the first time in decades, I wasn't afraid of that locked door. I was ready to face whatever came next.
The very next day, the scavengers arrived. I hadn't told a soul about the study, about the papers, about the fortune Patrick had hidden away in my name, but somehow they knew. Maybe they had always been suspicious. Maybe they could smell wealth the way jackals smell blood. Lenny was the first to show up. She didn't bother to call ahead, just marched into my living room as if it were her own. Her voice was syrupy, her smile too wide. "Amanda, dear," she said, her eyes sweeping the room, searching for the study door. "You must be so overwhelmed, so much to deal with all on your own." I just stared at her because I knew what was coming next. She settled herself on the sofa, folding her hands like a saint in a painting. "It would only be logical for me to assist. I've always managed the family's affairs, haven't I? And you've never been one for figures. Why don't you let me handle the estate, just for now, for your peace of mind?" Her words were honey, but her eyes were daggers. Then came David, the nephew. He brought flowers, as if I would forget who he was the moment I smelt roses. He called me Aunt Amanda in a voice so gentle it almost fooled me. "You shouldn't carry this burden," he said. "Why don't you let me oversee the finances? It's simply too much for you." Too much for me. Caroline came by later, lowering her voice into a tone of pity.
Everyone's talking, Auntie. They say you're fragile, that grief has clouded your judgment. You don't want people thinking you're incapable. Better to let us guide things before it gets complicated. Incapable, that word clung to me like a disease. And even my son, Michael, he sat across from me at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he didn't drink. Mom, he said gently, you can't manage all of this. You've never had to. Just be reasonable. Let the family help. Reasonable. Help. I wanted to laugh, but the sound was trapped in my throat. Each of them thought they were clever, disguising their greed as concern, but I had Patrick's words echoing in my head. They will plead. And I saw it now. This wasn't kindness. It was pleading disguised as charity. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I didn't give them the satisfaction. I simply said no. 3 letters, 1 word, stronger than any speech I could have given. Lenny's smile cracked like glass. David's flowers withered in my sight. Caroline's whisper turned sharp. Michael sighed and shook his head, disappointed, as though I were the child and he the parent. But I stood firm. For the first time in my life, I refused to yield. And as the door closed behind each of them, I knew something else. Patrick had been right. This was only the beginning. It didn't take long for the smiles to turn to snarls. When my rejections mounted, the visits changed. No more roses, no more sympathetic whispers. Now it was sharp voices, clipped tones, words that stung like whips. Victor came first, filling the doorway with his broad shoulders, his jaw tight. "Amanda," he said, no longer bothering to pretend, "you're making this more difficult than it needs to be. You can't handle an estate this size. I'm the eldest brother. It should fall to me. That's how family operates." I met his eyes, steadier than I felt. "No, Victor, that's not how it works." His face contorted, and for the first time, I saw the greed in him, raw and exposed. "If you think a signature makes you untouchable, you're a fool. Paper can be disputed. Wills can be contested. Don't test me." Then he laughed, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass. After him came Caroline. She leaned in close at the grocery store, her voice low and cruel. "People are already talking, Auntie. They say you're losing your mind, wailing at the funeral like a madwoman, forgetting things. It wouldn't be hard for a judge to declare you incompetent. Imagine what that would look like. All that wealth, all that property, seized. Better to hand it over now before you're humiliated." Her perfume clung to me long after she walked away, sickeningly sweet and stifling. David wasn't subtle either. He called late one night, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "Do you really think you can triumph against all of us? You'll exhaust yourself trying. Sign it over, Amanda. Be smart for once in your life." For once in my life, the words hit me like a stone. And then my own son, Michael. He didn't threaten, not directly. He just sighed over the phone, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Mom, you're making enemies of everyone. Don't you see? They'll ruin you. Just stop fighting. Give them what they want. It'll be easier." "Easier? For whom?" I hung up on him. That night, I discovered my car's tires had been slashed in the driveway, the rubber shredded clean through. My heart pounded as I stared at the damage, the air thick with the smell of scorched rubber. The next morning, I noticed the study door. The lock was scratched, the wood was splintered, clear signs of someone trying to force it open. The house, once my haven, no longer felt secure. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. Every shadow on the curtains looked like a figure waiting. But I remembered Patrick's words. They will scoff, then they will plead, then they will try to take. Do not yield. And I realized I was living the scenario he had written for me, every step of it. I was scared, yes, even terrified, but I was also furious. For 67 years, I had been their target, their joke, their weak link. And now, when they thought they could finally strip me of everything, I found something inside me they had never seen before: steel. So I locked the study more securely. I kept the documents close, and I waited. because I knew the next phase would come, and when it did, I would be ready.
I knew it was coming. Every visit had become more hostile. Every word carried more malice. It was only a matter of time before they dropped the pretense entirely. It happened one evening just after sunset. The sky still held a ribbon of gold at the horizon, but the house was dim, shadows stretching long across the floorboards. I had just finished making tea when the knock came, loud, urgent, insistent. I opened the door and they all filed in. Linny, Victor, Caroline, even David. Michael trailed behind them, his face pale, his eyes refusing to meet mine. They didn't wait for an invitation. They filled my living room like a thunderstorm. Victor spoke first, his voice booming. "Enough games, Amanda. We're done pleading. Hand over the documents." Linny sat down without asking, smoothing her skirt as though she owned the place. "It isn't right, you know. Patrick never meant for you to keep it all. You're confused. You've always been confused." Caroline stood near the window, arms crossed, eyes glittering with spite. "Everyone's laughing at you, Auntie. Do you know that? They say you're clinging to things you don't understand, that you're making a fool of yourself." And David, oh, David, he smiled like a viper. "We can resolve this quietly, or we can drag it into court. But if we do that, we'll bring everything into question. Your health, your memory, your sanity. Do you really want that kind of spectacle?" Their words battered me from all sides, louder and sharper with every breath. I tried to speak, but Victor cut me off, stepping closer, his finger jabbing the air. "Sign the papers, Amanda, tonight, or I swear." That was when I broke. "Or you swear what, Victor?" My voice trembled, but it was steady enough to slice through their clamor. "That you'll break into my study again? That you'll slash more tires? That you'll tell the whole town I'm insane?" The room went silent. Linny's mouth opened, but no words came. Caroline shifted uncomfortably, her mask of cruelty slipping. And Michael, my son, he finally looked at me, not with pity, not with dismissal, but with something I hadn't seen in years: respect. The judge cleared his throat. "Mrs. Miller, the will stands as written. The estate belongs solely to you. Case dismissed." It was over in a single motion. As they shuffled out, their heads low, I stayed seated, my hands resting on Patrick's box. I should have felt triumphant, victorious, but what I felt instead was quiet, a stillness that ran deeper than any silence I had ever known. I wasn't just the widow anymore. I wasn't the joke, the frail one, the shadow in the corner. I was Amanda Miller, and I had finally been heard.
I thought the confrontation in my living room would shatter me, but instead, it liberated me. They believed their anger would frighten me back into silence. They thought I'd shrink away the way I always had, bowing my head while their words sliced into me. But I had Patrick's documents. I had his voice in my ear. "Do not yield." So when the summons arrived, their challenge to the will, their attempt to have me declared incompetent, I wasn't afraid. My hand shook when I read it, yes, but there was no fear in my chest, only a burning resolve. On the morning of the hearing, I walked into that courthouse with the box clutched tight to my chest. Linny and Victor were already there, dressed in black as if sorrow could conceal their avarice. David was pacing, whispering frantically into his phone. Caroline sat in the corner, her face pale. And Michael avoided my eyes. They didn't anticipate me to come prepared. The judge asked for statements, and their lawyer stepped forward first. His words dripped with venom. "Mrs. Miller is grieving, unstable, unfit to manage such a vast estate. We have evidence of her erratic behavior, emotional instability, and lack of understanding of financial matters." Erratic, unfit. I had heard those words before. They had been whispered in dining rooms, smirked at family get-togethers, laughed over glasses of wine. And now they were carved into legal arguments, sharpened into blades meant to cut me down. But when it was my turn, I opened Patrick's box. "Your Honor," I said, my voice trembling but clear. "My husband anticipated this. He knew what his family would do. That's why he left these." I laid out the files, one by one. Patrick's will, signed and notarized. His recorded testimony, his face flickering on the screen as his voice filled the room. "If you are hearing this, it is because my wife is under attack. Everything I own belongs to her. I trust her with my life, even in death. To my family, scoff at her if you wish, but you cannot take what is hers." Gasps filled the room. Lenny's face turned scarlet. Victor muttered under his breath, fists tight. But I wasn't finished. I opened another file and another, spreading them like cards in a hand they couldn't beat. Evidence of Victor's hidden debts, proof of David's fraudulent dealings with company funds, records of Lenny siphoning from Patrick's accounts years ago. "This," I said, my voice steadier now, "is what my husband left me. Not just an inheritance, but the truth. And if they wish to drag me through the mud, I will drag them with me. Every document here will become public record. Every scheme, every theft, every lie." The silence that followed was heavier than the judge's gavel. Their lawyer stammered, trying to recover, but the damage was done. Lenny stared at the table, her hand shaking. Victor's bluster collapsed into quiet defeat. David's lips moved silently, calculating the cost of exposure. Caroline cried softly in the corner, mascara streaking her cheeks. And Michael, my son, he finally looked at me, not with pity, not with dismissal, but with something I hadn't seen in years: respect. The judge clears his throat. "Your Honor, the will stands as written. The estate belongs solely to you. Case dismissed." It was over in a single motion. As they shuffled out, their heads low, I stayed seated, my hands resting on Patrick's box. I should have felt triumphant, victorious. But what I felt instead was quiet, a stillness that ran deeper than any silence I had ever known. I wasn't just the widow anymore. I wasn't the joke, the frail one, the shadow in the corner. I was Amanda Miller, and I had finally been heard. When it was all done, when the gavel fell and the scavengers scattered, I went home to a house that felt entirely new. The quiet was still there, but it no longer pressed on me like a burden. It stretched around me like a space I finally owned. For the first time in decades, the quiet belonged to me, not to them. News traveled quickly. Lenny stopped showing her face in town after whispers of her thievery spread. Victor's debts dragged him down so deep he had to sell off half of his property. David's fraud came to light in the company he worked for. They fired him before he could drag them under. Caroline vanished for a while, embarrassed, then resurfaced with a bitterness that couldn't affect me anymore. And Michael, my son, he came to me a week later, shoulders slumped, eyes soft. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. "I should have stood by you." I looked at him for a long time. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind him how he let me face them alone. But another part, the larger part, only felt weary. Weary, but free. I told him, "You saw me the way they saw me. Now you know better." He nodded, shame flickering in his eyes. That was enough. I walked into the study that night and shut the door behind me. The same door I had feared for 43 years. The door I once thought marked the distance between me and my husband. Now, it was mine. The desk, the bookshelves, the documents, all mine. I sat down in the chair, running my hand over the polished wood, and let the truth sink in. I had survived them. I had survived their mockery, their pleading, their threats, and I had stood firm. Patrick's words echoed in my head once more. They will scoff, then they will plead, then they will try to take. Do not yield. He was right. They did, and I hadn't. For the first time in my life, I felt taller than every sneer, every insult, every laugh that had been carved into me over the years. They had underestimated me, dismissed me, tried to strip me of my grief, my dignity, my voice. And in the end, they destroyed themselves with their avarice. I looked around the study, this room I once thought was a prison, and saw it now for what it was, a gift. Not of money, not of property, but of justice. So I straightened the papers, folded Patrick's last letter, and placed it gently in the drawer. Then I leaned back in the chair, my hands resting calmly on the arms, and whispered to the empty room, I'm not yielding anymore. And the quiet at last felt like applause.